You have this very, very lengthy story in the New Yorker about Joe Biden's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, and the Washington front of the Ukraine war. Why a profile of Jake Sullivan, Susan?
Well, thank you, Charlie, for asking. I mean, it's interesting now that we have another enormous war that's going to draw in the United States and be very consuming for the Biden administration. I set out to write about the war that the U.S. has already committed so much to, the war in Ukraine. And, when I was talking to people, this is an issue that I have followed, obviously, for more than 2 decades since I served as a correspondent in Moscow for the Washington Post at the very beginning of Vladimir Putin's tenure. And of course, this kind of almost final bloody crescendo of Putinism in this kind of war of aggression on his neighbor has been an abiding interest of mine. What I heard from people in Washington was that, Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, really had become the war's indispensable man in Washington, that this is a very White House centric foreign policy team, and that Biden likes to keep a close hold on these decisions, and so too does his national security advisor. And that when it came to the decision making, if I wanted to understand why we were giving certain weapon systems, why we weren't doing other things, who was formulating our approach to the war, that I would need to write about Jake Sullivan, someone who I've actually known for a very long time.
So, you point out he's the youngest national security advisor since McGeorge Bundy during Vietnam, and there hasn't been a lot of, at least of feuds and infighting in the administration over Ukraine. But the administration's policy has not always been that clear, has it? I mean, vowing to stick with Ukraine for as long as it takes is not a strategy. This is from the House and Senate Foreign Affairs Committee. So, give me your sense of this. Do they have a strategy, or are they making it up as they go along?
Well, I think some of the most biting criticism, and by the way, this has come from Democrats as well as Republicans. Right. I think that's an important one. Many of the strong supporters of Ukraine are concerned about this too. It is the fear that the administration has been sort of incrementally boiling the frog, if you will. That it has. It didn't expect, of course, this war in Ukraine to explode the way that it did, and it didn't expect Ukraine to survive the initial onslaught. And so it's sort of like we all did. We backed into this long war. First of all, it's important to say it was the biggest military commitment. We have shipped more weapons there, really, to any other place since the end of World War II. And I'm not sure people really understand that. However, if I asked you, Charlie, and pushed you to the wall, could you really describe what the administration's strategy is, what its goal is? And I think a lot of it has to do, my conclusion was, first of all, a lot of it is blamed on Jake Sullivan, which is interesting, but he's ultimately Joe Biden's guy. And this is a Biden policy. He is not going to let Ukraine into NATO. He is trying to signal in every possible way to Putin, listen, it's not our war. You started this thing, buddy. Yeah. It's not us. We're just trying to give them the tools not to be overwhelmed. But I think the caution comes from Biden himself, but it also comes from our politics, Charlie. So this is where I would link up our Israel conversation and our Ukraine conversation. We don't have a real theory of the case of America's role in the world anymore, because we are a superpower in crisis, and we are not really able to project confidence in the rest of the world. It's painful almost to me when I hear Joe Biden in Warsaw giving this bold speech saying, it's the great challenge between democracies and autocracies, when I'm not sure he could give that speech here in Washington.
So you talk about how Jake Sullivan joined the administration in 2021, and one of the biggest events, obviously, of that year was the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan that led to a lot of people saying he ought to be fired. And he told you that that was his trial by fire, and he had taken it very, very personally. So, talk to me a little bit about that, because that was really one of the turning points for the Biden administration, and in terms of like our discussion about projection of weakness, we could argue a failed policy. So, what was Jake Sullivan's role in the abandonment of Afghanistan and the fall of Kabul?
Well, look, Jake Sullivan, I think as national security advisor understood that he would be blamed and was accountable for the handling of the withdrawal. I think you can say that the policy decision was Joe
Right.
Biden's, and it was
Right.
very clear from the very beginning. Joe Biden felt that the United States had spent 20 years and had not succeeded in its mission in Afghanistan, and he didn't want any other American soldiers to die in the pursuit of a mission he had concluded long ago, I think, could not be achieved. They felt constrained by a number of things, including Donald Trump's deal with the Taliban, which really, sort of restricted them in their view and tied their hands in terms of their options for how they would do that withdrawal. Where the blame, I think, has more properly fallen on Sullivan and on the rest of the Biden administration is how they chose to execute and to carry out the withdrawal. You can have an argument over the policy, but I think the critiques that have landed the most fairly and squarely on them are the critiques of how they undertook that withdrawal. And for Sullivan, you described him, right? He's the youngest guy since McGeorge Bundy. He's a brilliant Rhodes Scholar. He's had a dazzling career, right? And so he isn't used to screwing up like this. And I think that it's that experience of failure and that's with real lives in consequence was a terrible blow for all of them at the beginning of this administration when they're just figuring out how to do their jobs and to work as a team. Another blow, of course, that Sullivan had, unlike others with that kind of dazzling resume. Remember, he was Hillary Clinton's most closest advisor for many years on policy matters. And he experienced the 2016 defeat in a very visceral, personal way. So I think that shaped his approach to the job. I think Afghanistan did. And then the third thing that I think has not gotten enough attention is Obama's kind of screwed up reaction to the 2014 Russian takeover of Crimea and launching of a proxy war in eastern Afghanistan. Jake Sullivan was then Joe Biden's vice presidential national security advisor. Tony Blinken, now the Secretary of State, was the deputy national security advisor at that time for Obama. They were, and Biden himself, were very internally critical of Obama's response. They didn't think it was strong enough. They were all advocates of sending military security assistance to Ukraine to be able to fight back against the Russians. Obama rejected them. And so I think that shaped them too. They didn't want a repeat of what the Obama administration had done, which in their view was insufficient to counter Putin. And I think history shows that it was insufficient.